A young woman stands in the snow beside a mountain man twice her size. Three riders emerge from the tree line. The one in front smiles and calls out a name that is not hers. "You run far for a girl who belongs to me." She holds the revolver with a steadiness that defies her past. "I am not yours." 7 days ago she was dying under a broken wagon. This is how she got here. The wind across the Montana plains did not howl like a lonely animal that winter. It roared like something alive, something ancient and starving, something that had crawled down from the peaks with its mouth open and its eyes blind. It tore over the frozen land and slammed against anything standing upright. Trees bent at angles that should have snapped them. Snow did not fall from the sky so much as it attacked from every direction at once, driving sideways, driving upward, filling the lungs of any creature foolish enough to breathe with its mouth open. Winter in Montana in the year 1883 did not forgive mistakes. It did not offer second chances. It buried them. But before we begin at the beginning, you need to see something. You need to understand what this story becomes. Because 7 days from now, a man named Boone Calloway will stand on the porch of his cabin with a rifle in his hands and dried blood cracking along a cut above his eye. His breath will come out in clouds that vanish the moment the wind touches them. Behind him, through the cracked door, you will see the silhouette of a young woman standing at the window. She will be thin, wearing a wool shirt 3 sizes too large, and in her hands she will hold a revolver with a steadiness that was not there a week ago. 3 riders will emerge from the tree line. Their horses will be dark against the snow. The man in front will dismount slowly, smiling, and he will call out a name that does not belong to the woman inside. "Clara," he will say, his voice carrying through the frozen air like something poured from a bottle. "You run far for a girl who belongs to me." And the woman will step out beside Boone Calloway, and her hand will not shake, and she will say, "I am not yours." That is where this story goes. But to understand how it gets there, we need to go back. 7 days, to a storm, to a broken wagon, and to a hand small and pale and bare, reaching out from under splintered wood like a last prayer no one was supposed to answer. 7 days earlier, Boone Calloway walked straight into that storm the way a man walks into a room he has been inside 1,000 times, not because it was safe, because he knew every corner where danger could hide, and he had decided long ago that the danger was manageable. The cold was manageable. The wind was manageable. What was not manageable was people. He was tall enough that the top of his head would brush the ceiling beams inside his cabin. His shoulders were wide enough to block half the wind that came screaming across the open ground between the tree line and the ridge. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was long, pulled back behind his neck and tied with a strip of leather that had gone gray from years of weather. His hands were enormous inside cracked leather gloves, the kind of hands built by years of splitting wood and setting traps and skinning elk and doing every single thing a man must do when he chooses to live where no one else will follow. A scar ran from behind his left ear, down into his collar. It was thick and pale and old, and if you looked at it long enough, you could almost hear the story it told. But Boone Calloway did not tell that story, not to anyone. Not anymore. A fresh cut split his eyebrow on the right side, put there by a low branch that had snapped under the weight of ice and caught him across the face 2 hours ago. The blood had dried stiff against his skin. He did not wipe it. He did not feel it. There were things that hurt Boone Calloway, but a cut from a branch was not among them. Behind him, a single mule dragged a small wooden sled loaded with 2 elk carcasses. Food for the season. Survival. Nothing more and nothing less. He had tracked the elk for 2 days, killed them both with single shots because ammunition was expensive and because wasted shots meant wasted time, and wasted time in a Montana winter meant death. He lived alone on this mountain, and he had lived alone for 3 years. Not because he hated people. He had tried that explanation, and it never fit. The truth was simpler and uglier. Boone Calloway lived alone because he was afraid of what he was capable of when he stayed too close to other human beings for too long. He had learned what his hands could do. He had learned how easy it was, and the ease of it. The terrifying mechanical ease was the thing that had driven him up this mountain and kept him here through 3 winters that would have killed most men. But we will get to that. The mountain has patience. So does the story. His cabin sat between thick pines at the base of a ridge 2 hours on horseback from the nearest town, a place called Elk Crossing, that was not much of a town at all. He had built the cabin himself 3 winters ago, shortly after Emmett's death, when he first sought the silence of the high timber. Thick log walls, 1 narrow window, a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side because he had run out of good mortar on the last day and used mud instead, and the mud had shifted over the years but held well enough. Inside it smelled of pine smoke and tanned leather and something else, something harder to name. Solitude, maybe. The particular scent of a man who has stopped expecting anyone to walk through the door. 1 bed, 1 table, 1 chair, 1 gun rack holding a rifle and a spare revolver. That was all. Nothing extra. Nothing that said the man who lived here wanted to be found. The snow came down harder as he approached the tree line. He lowered his head and pulled the collar of his bearskin coat tighter and kept moving 1 foot in front of the other, the mule plodding behind him with the patience of an animal that had stopped caring about comfort a long time ago. That was when he saw it. A wagon half broken, listing hard to one side where the front left wheel had split clean in 2. It was sunk deep in frozen mud that had locked around the axle like a fist. The canvas top was ripped open and snapping in the wind like a torn flag surrendering to an army it could not see. No horses, no tracks fresh enough to follow. The snow had already covered whatever path the horses had taken when they bolted or were cut loose, and there was no way to know which. Boone stopped. He stood in the wind and the snow, and he looked at that wagon for a long moment. A man alone in winter did not stop for other people's trouble. That was not selfishness. That was arithmetic. Every hour spent on someone else's problem was an hour you were not spending keeping yourself alive, and in this country, the margin between living and dying was measured in hours, not days. He should have kept walking. Then he saw the hand. It was small. It was bare. It was so pale against the dark wood of the wagon bed that for a moment he thought it was a piece of cloth caught in the wind. But cloth does not have fingers. Cloth does not curl slightly inward the way a hand curls when the body it belongs to has used its last strength to reach for something and found nothing to hold on to. The hand was tucked beneath the rear axle of the wagon, extending out from underneath the bed where someone had crawled or been shoved or had dragged themselves in a final desperate attempt to escape the wind. Boone Calloway stood still for 1 long breath. He looked at that hand. He looked at the storm swirling around him. He looked at the tree line where his cabin waited warm and dark and safe. He thought about the 2 elk on his sled, about the fire he would build, about the silence that would greet him when he stepped inside. He thought about how much easier it would be to keep walking. The storm would finish whatever someone else had started. No witness, no burden. No complication in a life he had stripped down to the barest elements precisely to avoid complications. Boone Calloway was not a smart man in that moment. He knew it even as he stepped off his path and walked toward the broken wagon. He knelt beside the axle and looked underneath. She was wedged into the space between the frozen ground and the wagon bed, curled tight, as if she were trying to fold herself into the earth and disappear. Her dress was thin, far too thin for this weather, and it was torn at the shoulder. Her hair, which might have been golden in warmer light, was matted dark with ice and dirt and something that could have been dried blood. Her lips were cracked and had turned a shade of blue that Boone recognized. It was the color that came just before the body stopped trying. A bruise colored one side of her face. Not a small bruise, not the kind you get from bumping into a door. The mark on her face spoke of a calculated blow, a shadow of violence that no winter storm could cause. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The skin was so cold it almost hurt to touch. He held still, waiting. Nothing. Then so faint he almost missed it a pulse. Thin and slow, and barely there like a candle flame in a drafty room still burning, but only just ready to go out at the first hard breath. Alive. He exhaled slowly through his nose. His breath made a cloud that the wind tore apart instantly. He looked at her face. Young. Too young to be out here alone. Too thin to have been eating properly in weeks. And those bruises on her face were not from the wagon crash. Any smart man would leave her. He had already established that he was not being smart. He slid his arms beneath her body and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. He had carried newborn calves that weighed more than this woman. That fact settled into his chest like a stone. Someone had not been feeding her. Someone had been keeping her alive just enough to use her, but not enough for her to have the strength to resist. He had seen animals treated this way. He had never expected to see it done to a person. Her head fell against his chest as he lifted her out from under the wagon. She did not wake. She did not make a sound. Her breathing was so shallow that he had to watch her chest to be sure it was still happening. He carried her to the sled, set her down beside the elk carcasses, with a care that would have surprised anyone who knew him, and wrapped his spare fur over her body. He tucked it around her shoulders, around her legs, and tightened the rope so she would not slip off when the sled hit rough ground. Then he turned toward the tree line and started walking again, pulling behind him 2 dead elk and 1 woman who was not far from joining them. The cabin was dark when he reached it. He left the elk outside covered in snow and carried the woman through the door. He set her on the bed, the only bed, and for a moment he stood over her in the dim room and just looked at her face. Young, damaged, still alive for reasons that probably had more to do with stubbornness than luck. The fire had died to embers. He crouched before the hearth, fed it dry wood, and blew low and steady until the flames caught and began to grow. Heat spread slowly into the room, pushing back the cold, the way light pushes back shadow, not all at once, but inch by inch, corner by corner. He boiled water in the iron pot that hung from a hook above the fire. He took his skinning knife, the sharpest one, and began to cut away the frozen cloth of her dress. He worked slowly, carefully, 1 layer at a time. He kept his eyes on the work, on the fabric, on the angle of the blade, not on her body. There were men who would have looked. Boone Calloway was not one of them. The fabric fell away, and what was underneath it made him stop. Signs of a hard life covered her ribs. Shadows of past cruelty, some fading, some still painfully vivid. And on her left shoulder, just below the collarbone, a permanent mark that made Boone Calloway's hands go still. A jagged, raised scar in the shape of a letter K. It was a sign of ownership, a wound that had healed but would never disappear. Boone stared at that mark for a long time. He had branded cattle. He had seen brands on horses his entire life. He had never in 33 years of living seen a brand on a human being. His jaw tightened until the muscles at his temples stood out like cables. His hands curled into fists so tight that the knuckles went white beneath the dirt and the dried blood. He could feel the anger rising, not hot and fast, the way anger comes to young men, but cold and slow, the way it comes to men who have already killed and know exactly what the anger is capable of producing. He held still. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3. Then he unclenched his fists, slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down a loaded gun. He cleaned her wounds with warm water and strips of clean cloth. He worked methodically, the way he did everything, checking each cut, each bruise, each mark, cataloging the damage, the way a man catalogs the damage to a building after a storm, not with emotion, but with attention. When he reached the brand on her shoulder, he cleaned around it gently, touching the scarred skin with a lightness that seemed impossible for hands that large. He pulled one of his own wool shirts over her head. It hung to her knees. He covered her with the heaviest bear fur he owned and tucked it around her the way you tuck a blanket around something fragile, something you are afraid the wind will carry away. Then he moved to the chair near the wall and sat down. He placed the rifle across his knees. He did not sleep. Hours passed. The storm battered the cabin walls, howled through the gaps in the window frame, screamed across the chimney top. But inside there was only the sound of the fire and her breathing, shallow but steady, and Boone sat in the dark and watched the door and waited for whatever was going to happen next. She woke near dawn. It was not a gentle waking. She gasped a sound that cut through the quiet of the cabin like a blade, and her eyes flew open wide and wild pupils dilated, the whites showing all around. She bolted upright so fast the bear fur slid to her waist, and for a second she just sat there, chest heaving, head whipping back and forth as she tried to understand where she was. Her eyes found him in the shadows, a massive shape sitting against the far wall, still and dark and silent. "Where am I?" Her voice was a rasp, barely above a whisper, the sound of a throat that had been screaming or crying or both. "My cabin," Boone said. She flinched at the sound of his voice the way a horse flinches at a gunshot. Her whole body jerked backward, and her hands came up and grabbed the wool shirt tight across her chest, and her breathing went fast and shallow, the breathing of a hunted animal that has just realized it is cornered. "Don't touch me," she whispered. "I won't." He stood up slowly, every movement deliberate, every gesture visible. He walked to the pot of broth warming near the fire, poured some into a tin cup, and set it on the floor exactly halfway between where he stood and where she sat. Then he stepped back. 2 full paces. He leaned against the far wall and crossed his arms. "You need heat inside you," he said. "Drink it when you are ready." She did not move. She watched him with eyes that were cataloging every possible threat, measuring the distance to the door, to the window, to the knife on the table, calculating how fast he could cross the room, whether she could reach something sharp before he reached her. Boone recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had learned through experience that the space between safety and violence could collapse in the time it took a man to change his mind. He did not move. He kept his arms crossed. He kept his eyes steady but distant, looking at a point on the wall past her shoulder rather than directly into her face, giving her room, giving her the only thing he could give right now, which was the absence of threat. After a long minute she crawled forward, not standing, not walking, crawling on her hands and knees across the rough plank floor the way a person crawls when they do not trust their legs to hold them. She reached the cup and grabbed it with both hands. They were shaking so badly that broth sloshed over the rim and ran down her fingers and dripped onto the floor. Boone looked away. He turned his head toward the window and studied the snow piled against the glass as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. That confused her more than anything else he could have done. She had been watching him the way she watched all men, waiting for the angle, waiting for the demand, waiting for the hand to reach out and grab. She understood men who stared. She understood men who wanted things. A man who poured broth and stepped back and then looked away so she could drink without being observed, that was a language she had not learned. She drank the broth in small sips, still watching him over the rim of the cup. He did not turn back until he heard the cup set down on the floor. Days passed. That is a simple sentence, but the days were not simple. They were long and quiet, and filled with a careful choreography of distance that both of them maintained without ever discussing it. She slept for long stretches, sometimes 12 or 14 hours, the deep, dreamless sleep of a body that had been running on fear and was finally shutting down to repair itself. He changed her bandages each morning. He was efficient about it and did not speak more than necessary. Turn. Hold still. Done. 3 words, sometimes fewer. She endured it with a rigid stillness that told him she was holding her breath the entire time his hands were near her skin. He slept in the chair, every night. He never mentioned the bed. He never suggested they take turns. He simply sat in the chair with the rifle across his knees and closed his eyes, and by morning he was awake again before she stirred. If his back ached from sleeping upright on hard wood, he did not show it. Discomfort was a language Boone Calloway spoke fluently, and he never complained in it. He cooked simple meals: elk stew, bone broth, hard bread he had baked a week ago that required dunking in broth before it could be chewed. He set her portion on the table and took his own to the far corner of the room and ate standing up, leaning against the wall. He never sat at the table with her. He never positioned himself between her and the door. She noticed everything. She noticed that he kept the knife and the spare revolver in plain sight on the shelf, never hidden, never giving himself a secret advantage. She noticed that he knocked on the door frame before entering the cabin, even though it was his own home. She noticed that when he walked past her and she flinched, he stopped immediately, took one step backward and said quietly, "Just me." 2 words that cost him nothing and gave her something she could not name. On the 4th day she could stand without swaying. The cabin felt smaller now that she was aware of it, now that she was on her feet and could measure the space with her own body. 1 bed, 1 table, 1 chair. 1 man whose head nearly brushed the ceiling beams, whose shoulders stretched the seams of his shirts, who had a scar running from his ear into his collar and hands big enough to crush a tin cup flat. And yet who moved through this small space with a quietness that seemed impossible, careful, always careful, never crowding, never closing the distance unless she allowed it. The silence between them was thick, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had both learned that words could be weapons and were being cautious about which ones they picked up. It broke on the 4th night. Outside, snow had buried the window until only white showed through the glass. Inside, the fire crackled low. Boone sat in the chair carving a small piece of wood, shaving it slowly into the shape of a bird, with a knife that moved in his hands with a precision that seemed wrong for fingers that thick. She sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the bear fur, watching him. "Why did you bring me here?" He did not look up from his carving. "You would have died." "That is not an answer." He glanced at her. His eyes were gray in the firelight. "It is the only one I have." She narrowed her eyes. "Men do not help for free." He went back to carving. The knife shaved a thin curl of wood that fell to the floor. "I am not most men." Her voice sharpened. "What do you want?" He set the knife down. He set the half-finished bird on the table beside it. He met her gaze fully directly, without any evasion and without any heat. "Nothing." Silence pressed between them like a third person in the room. She stood abruptly, the bear fur falling from her shoulders, and began pacing. 3 steps to the wall, 3 steps back. The cabin was too small for proper pacing, but she paced it anyway, driven by an energy that had been building for 4 days of silence. "Then why stay out here alone?" she demanded. "Why hide from everyone?" His jaw flexed. The muscle at the corner of his mouth tightened. "You should sit down." "I am tired of sitting." He stood then, and the room shrank. It was not a threatening movement, but it did not need to be. His size did the work for him the way a mountain does the work of intimidation, simply by existing. For a second, fear flickered in her eyes again, that old familiar fear, the one that lived in the space between her heartbeats and her breathing. He saw it, and something crossed his face that she did not expect. Not anger, not frustration. Pain. It was pain. "I know my strength," he said quietly. The words came out low, almost gentle, the voice of a man speaking to a spooked animal that he did not want to startle. "And I will not use it wrong." Then he grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and stepped outside into the storm. The door closed behind him. The cabin felt colder instantly, as if his body heat had been keeping the room warm in a way the fire alone could not. She stared at the door long after he disappeared. Later that night, unable to sleep, she found something. Tucked beneath folded pelts in the corner, a small leather journal, soft from years of handling, the binding worn thin. She knew she should not open it. She opened it. Inside were charcoal sketches, mountains drawn with a careful hand. Wolves standing in snow, a hawk in flight wings spread wide, every feather detailed with a patience that seemed to belong to a different man than the one who moved through this cabin with such deliberate restraint. And between the drawings, lines of careful writing, small letters pressed into the page with a sharpened piece of charcoal. She read, "Emmett did not run because he was brave. He ran because he believed in people. I killed 2 men that night. I do not regret that they died. I regret that I felt nothing when I did it." And further on, 3 years, the silence helps. But some mornings I wake up and my hands are already fists, and I do not remember what I was dreaming, and I think maybe the thing I am running from is not behind me, but inside me, and I do not know how to outrun what lives in your own chest. Her throat tightened. The words blurred. She was still reading when the door opened and he stepped inside, snow falling from his shoulders like white ash. He stopped when he saw what was in her hands. His eyes went to the journal, then to her face. No anger came. She braced for it, the way she braced for everything, shoulders pulling inward, chin dropping, body making itself smaller. But the blow never arrived. What she saw instead was something that looked like sadness. Not the sadness of a man whose privacy has been invaded. Something deeper. The sadness of a man who has written his worst truths on paper and has just watched someone read them and is now waiting to see if she will look at him differently. He walked forward slowly. He took the journal from her hands gently, the way you take something from a child who does not realize it is fragile. He placed it back where it belonged. He did not say a word. She did not say a word. But something changed that night. Not trust, not yet. Something softer, something underneath trust, the foundation that trust would eventually be built on. Like the first warmth of spring reaching down through frozen soil, not enough to melt anything yet, but enough to remind the earth that melting is possible. But 2 hours south in a saloon in Elk Crossing, the man who had put those bruises on her face was not sleeping either. Judson Crail sat at his private table in the back room, a glass of whiskey, catching the lamplight, his coat of brown mink draped over the chair beside him. He was 45 years old, and he looked like a man who had made a career out of being trusted. Clean-shaven, gold-rimmed spectacles, a slow smile that reached his eyes at exactly the right speed to make you believe it was genuine. He spoke softly because he had learned long ago that quiet men are feared more than loud ones. The loud ones have already shown you what they have. The quiet ones might still be hiding something. Across from him, a man named Polk sat with his hat in his lap. Polk was thin and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who noticed things, who counted exits, who remembered faces. He had been riding the northern trails for 2 days. "Horse died on the North Pass," Polk said. "Cold got it. Found tracks heading northwest toward Pine Ridge. Small, female." Crail took a sip of whiskey. He held it in his mouth for a moment before swallowing. "Pine Ridge," he said. "Nobody lives up there. Except—" Polk shifted in his chair. "Mountain man, name of Calloway, trapper, loner, big fellow, keeps to himself." Crail set his glass down. The smile came slow and unhurried, the way dawn comes to a valley when the sun is taking its time. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting." He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out a leather ledger. Inside were names written in neat columns. 6 names. Beside each name a date, a running total of debt that never seemed to decrease, and a single word followed by a dollar amount. The word was assigned. The price of a human life written in ink. Alara Whitmore was the 5th name on the list. Her debt column ran longer than most. Crail closed the ledger and looked at Polk. "Find the cabin. Confirm she is there. Do not approach. Do not engage. Just confirm. And then—" Crail leaned back in his chair. "And then we bring her home." He said it the way a man says he is going to bring in the horses before dark. Simply, without emotion. As if the woman he was discussing were no different from any other piece of property that had wandered off and needed to be collected. Back in the cabin on Pine Ridge, Boone Calloway sat in his chair with the rifle across his knees and watched the fire die to embers. The woman slept. Her breathing was deeper now than it had been the first night, steadier, and the color in her lips had shifted from blue to something closer to pink, which meant her body was warming, which meant she was pulling back from the edge. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something else, something he had not felt in 3 years. The heavy, quiet weight of responsibility. He had saved a life, and now that life was inside his cabin, inside his silence, inside the careful structure of solitude he had built around himself like a wall. And walls once breached are never quite the same. Outside the storm raged on. But somewhere beneath it, so faint he almost missed it, a sound carried through the trees. It could have been a branch snapping under the weight of ice. It could have been something else. Boone's hand tightened on the rifle stock. His eyes moved to the window. He watched the white darkness beyond the glass and listened with the attention of a man who knew that in this country the things that killed you were usually the things you did not hear coming. And deep in the woman's chest, beneath the bruises and the fear and the brand that someone had burned into her shoulder like a mark of ownership, something small and stubborn continued to beat. A heart that had been given every reason to stop and had not stopped. A heart that was against all evidence and all probability still deciding to live. She did not know it yet. She did not know that the man sitting in the dark with a rifle on his knees was fighting a war inside himself that had nothing to do with her. She did not know that somewhere to the south a man in a mink coat was already drawing lines on a map, narrowing the circle, moving closer. She did not know any of this. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years she had slept through the night without dreaming of the letter K. And somewhere outside in the darkness between the pines, something that might have been hoofbeats faded into the wind and was gone. The morning after she found his journal, the air inside the cabin carried a different weight. Not heavier, not lighter. Changed. The way air changes after a thunderstorm has passed through and left everything the same shape but somehow altered at the molecular level, rearranged in ways you can feel on your skin but cannot see with your eyes. Boone handed her a pair of mittens before she had finished the broth he had set on the table. They were his, enormous on her hands, the leather soft from years of wear and smelling of pine resin and animal fat. "You will help with the wood today," he said. She looked at the mittens, then at him. "I do not know how." "You will learn." He said it the way he said everything, without inflection, without negotiation, as if the fact of her learning was already settled and all that remained was the doing of it. Outside, the cold bit hard enough to sting tears from her eyes before she had taken 3 steps from the door. The sky was the color of old iron, low and heavy, pressing down on the mountains like a lid being slowly closed on a pot. Boone walked to the woodpile behind the cabin where logs lay stacked against the wall, each one roughly the length of a man's arm and thick enough that she could not have wrapped both hands around them. He set a log upright on the splitting stump. He placed the axe in her hands, wrapping her fingers around the handle and adjusting her grip without touching her skin. His hands moved near hers, but never made contact, and she noticed this the way she noticed everything about him now with a sharpness that surprised her. "Stand wider," he said. "Feet apart. The weight of the axe does the work. You just guide it down." She swung. The blade glanced off the edge of the log and buried itself in the stump beside it. She yanked it free and swung again, this time catching the top of the log, but only gouging a shallow wound in the grain. Frustration flushed her cheeks red. Her arms were shaking, and not just from the cold. He did not laugh. He did not take the axe from her. He did not offer to do it himself. He stood 3 paces back with his arms folded across his chest and said one word. "Again." The 3rd strike came down clean and true. The log split straight down the middle, the 2 halves falling away from each other with a crack that echoed off the pines. She stood there with the axe still in her hands and her breath coming in fast white clouds, and for a moment she looked at what she had done with an expression Boone recognized because he had seen it on the faces of men who had just realized they were capable of something they had been told they could not do. Pride. Small and fierce and startled like a bird that has been kept in a cage so long it has forgotten it has wings. He noticed. He said nothing. But something in his eyes went soft for just a moment before he turned away and began stacking the split wood against the cabin wall. In the days that followed, she learned more than wood splitting. He taught her to shoot. He set up a target behind the cabin, a section of log propped against a fallen tree, and handed her the spare revolver. It was heavy in her small hands, heavier than she expected, and the first time she pulled the trigger, the recoil kicked her wrist back and the shot went wide by 3 feet. He stood behind her, close enough to correct her stance, but far enough that she could not feel his breath. He talked her through it in short, clear sentences. "Both hands, left under right. Squeeze, do not pull. Let the barrel settle before you fire." 5 shots missed. The 6th hit the edge of the log. By the 10th, she was putting rounds within a hand's width of center. She lowered the gun and turned to look at him, and though she did not smile, something in her face had changed. Some tension that had been living in the muscles around her eyes had loosened by a fraction. He gave her a single nod. That was all the praise she needed, and somehow she knew that it was all the praise he knew how to give. He taught her to read tracks in the snow, to identify which prints belonged to deer and which to elk and which to wolves and which to men. He showed her how to set a snare from braided cord, how to find her way back to the cabin using the blaze marks he had cut into the pines years ago. Small notches at eye level that you would never notice unless you knew to look. She asked more questions in those hours in the forest than he had heard from any human voice in 3 years, and he answered each one with the patient brevity of a man who respects both the question and the silence that follows the answer. The cabin changed without either of them deciding to change it. She swept the floor with a bundle of pine branches bound together with twine. She mended the torn blankets with a needle she found in his kit, her stitches small and even the work of hands that had been trained in domestic labor long before they had been trained in fear. She took his thin stew and transformed it into something that actually tasted of food, adding dried herbs she had found hanging from the rafters that he had gathered months ago and forgotten about. The first time he tasted it, he said nothing. He simply reached for a second portion. She understood. The space between them grew warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was in the way he began leaving the cabin door open a crack when he went outside so she could hear him moving around and know that his absence was temporary. It was in the way she started humming while she worked softly, barely audible, a sound she had not made in 2 years. It was in the way he carved the bird he had been working on and set it on the windowsill without explanation, and she moved it to the table where the light caught its wings, and neither of them mentioned it. Her name came on the 5th evening like a confession. They were sitting on either side of the fire, him in the chair, and her on the floor with the bear fur wrapped around her shoulders. The flames threw shifting shadows on the walls, and the wind had died to a murmur outside. "Ilara," she said softly. "That is my name, not the one they used." He looked at her. The firelight caught the edge of his scar and turned it copper. "Boone," he said. She had already known. She had read it in his journal. But hearing him offer it, hearing him give it freely as something shared rather than something discovered, made it different, made it real. Like two people who have been standing on opposite sides of a river, finally agreeing that the river has a name. "Boone," she repeated quietly, testing the sound and the way she said it, careful, almost gentle, as if she were handling something that might break, did something to his chest that he was not prepared for. A shift, a loosening, like a knot that has been tied for years beginning to work itself free without anyone pulling on it. He looked away, back at the fire, and they sat together in a silence that was for the first time not the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two people who had agreed to be in the same room and were beginning to learn what that meant. What Boone did not tell her was what he had found that morning. He had left before dawn to check the trap line. The traps were set in a wide arc around the cabin, a 3-hour loop through heavy timber, and he walked it every other day. On the ridge above the cabin, a 1/4 mile east, he found what he had been afraid of finding. 2 sets of hoof prints pressed deep into the snow. Heavy horses. The prints circled the ridgetop twice, pausing at the point where the terrain dropped away and the cabin was visible through a gap in the pines. Cigarette butts still faintly stained with saliva that had not yet frozen completely. And beside the hoof prints, a single empty brass cartridge from a rifle. Not fired. Dropped. Deliberately, the way a man drops a calling card. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had stood on that ridge and looked down through the gap in the trees and seen smoke rising from his chimney. Someone knew. That evening, after names had been exchanged, after the silence had settled into something resembling peace, Boone told her only part of what he had seen. "Someone rode near here," he said. "Heavy horse, clean saddle marks, circled once, did not come close." Her face went white. Not gradually, not the slow draining of color that comes with bad news, but all at once, as if someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood rush downward. Her hands gripped the edge of the bear fur so hard her knuckles turned to bone. "He found me," she whispered. "I do not know that." "But you think it." He did not deny it. There was no point in lying to a woman who had survived what she had survived by learning to read the things men did not say. That night she woke to find him sitting in the chair, eyes open, rifle across his knees. The fire had burned low, casting the room in shades of amber and shadow. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the door, waiting. Fear returned to her like a hand closing around her throat. "Who are you hiding from?" she asked from the darkness of the bed. He did not turn his head. "Men who think they own things." Her breath caught. "I was owned." Now he turned. His eyes found hers across the dim room. Not anymore. Outside, the wind carried sounds that could have been branches breaking under ice or could have been hoofbeats muffled by distance and snow. Neither of them slept. And deep in her chest, beneath the fear that had been her companion for so long she had forgotten what its absence felt like, something new began to grow. Not safety. Not yet. Something that came before safety. The possibility of it. The faint, dangerous, terrifying possibility that she might be in a place where harm would not reach her. She was wrong about that. Harm was already on its way, but she did not know it yet, and neither did he. 2 nights later, the conversation he had been avoiding found him. The fire was burning low again. She had taken to sitting closer to it in the evenings, not for warmth, but because the light made the cabin feel smaller and smaller, meant safer and safer, was something she was only now beginning to understand she wanted. Boone sat in his chair, which he had moved slightly closer to the fire over the past few days, without either of them commenting on the decreasing distance. "You have killed before," she said. Not a question. She was past questions now. "Yes." "Does it stay with you?" "Yes." She swallowed. "Why do you live alone?" He leaned back. The chair creaked under his weight. His eyes were on the flames, and in the shifting light his face looked older than 33, worn by something heavier than weather. "I had a ranch once," he said, "south of here. Cattle fences plans. My brother Emmett and I built it from nothing. 2 years of work. We thought we had something." She waited. She had learned that Boone's stories came the way snow melts in spring, slowly, unevenly, and you could not rush it without ruining it. Men wanted the land, said we had taken ground that was not ours. One night they came, set fire to the horse barn. Emmett ran out because that was who Emmett was. He heard the horses screaming, and he ran toward the sound because he could not stand to hear a living thing in pain. His voice did not break. It did not waver. It simply paused for one beat, the way a heart pauses between contractions. They shot him when he came through the barn door. He was 29 years old. The fire popped. A log shifted and sent a column of sparks swirling upward into the chimney. "I killed 2 of them," Boone continued, "with my hands, with a knife. The rest rode off, and I stood there in the dark with blood on my arms and my brother dead in the doorway and the horses still screaming inside the burning barn." Silence. "I left before I became the kind of man who spends the rest of his life hunting revenge, because I could feel it, the wanting, the ease of it. Standing over those 2 bodies, I did not feel horror. I did not feel guilt. I felt nothing, and the nothing was what scared me worse than anything else." Alara was very still. "You are not hiding," she said slowly, and her voice carried the weight of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything that came before it. "You are stopping yourself." He did not answer, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker, the way a lamp flame shifts when a door opens in another room and a draft moves through the house. "I know what I am capable of," he said very quietly. "Do you understand that I know how many men I could kill? And I know that if I start, I might not be able to stop. That is why I am here. That is why the mountain. That is why the silence." She did not pull back. She did not let fear take her face. She looked at him across the firelight with an expression he had not seen directed at him in 3 years. Not pity, not horror, recognition. the recognition of one damaged person looking at another and seeing the damage clearly and choosing to stay anyway. "I know you could," she said. "I also know you can choose not to." That sentence, those 9 words, they landed in his chest like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples moved outward through every part of him, through 3 years of silence and solitude and self-imposed exile. And for the first time since Emmett died, Boone Calloway felt something crack inside himself that was not breaking but opening. The days after that conversation were different. The distance between them, which had been shrinking in inches, now shrank in feet. She sat at the table while he ate. He sat by the fire while she mended. They existed in the same small space without the constant negotiation of boundaries that had defined their first week, and while neither of them named what was happening between them, they both felt it. The way you feel the temperature rise in a room when someone has added wood to the fire without announcing it. And then the sun went low one evening and painted the snow pale gold through the cabin window, and Alara stood up from the table and walked toward him. Her steps were careful but certain, not the hesitant shuffling of a woman approaching something she feared. The measured, deliberate steps of a woman who had made a decision and was carrying it forward before she could talk herself out of it. She stopped in front of his chair, close enough to feel his warmth, close enough to see the scar that ran from his ear to his collar, the texture of it, the history written in raised white tissue. "You saved me," she said. He looked up at her. "I was ready to die," she said. "Out there in the snow under that wagon I had stopped fighting. You are the reason I am still here." His jaw tightened. "You are still here because of you. I just carried you inside." Her voice softened. "I am not talking about debt." She lowered herself onto the edge of the table beside his chair, close enough that if either of them moved 6 inches, their bodies would touch. The closeness was deliberate. She was testing something. Testing herself, testing him, testing the space between them to see if it was as safe as she needed it to be. "No one has ever touched me because I wanted them to," she said, for the first time, out loud. The words that had been locked inside her for 2 years behind a door she had bolted shut with everything she had. His hands gripped the arms of the chair so hard the wood groaned. "Alara!" She slid off the table until she was standing between his knees. She did not touch him. Her fingers hovered near his chest, not quite making contact close enough that he could feel the heat of her hand through his shirt. "You are afraid," she whispered, "of yourself, of hurting me. You do not understand. Then make me understand." His voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "I am bigger than any man you have known. Stronger. When I lose control, things break." Her eyes never left his. "I have been broken before." He flinched, visibly, as if she had reached out and struck him. "I will not be the one who does it again." The fire popped behind them. The room felt small enough to hold in your hands. Alara reached up slowly and placed her palm flat against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering beneath the wool, fast and hard, the heartbeat of a man fighting himself. "I do not want gentleness because you pity me," she said. "I want you because you see me." His breath went ragged. "I see you." "Then stop holding back." She climbed into his lap before she could lose her nerve, straddled him, her knees pressed against his hips, her hands resting on his shoulders. He sucked in a breath so sharp it sounded like pain. "Alara." She leaned closer. Her hair brushed his jaw. "I am not afraid of you. You should be. I am not." His hands hung in the air on either side of her body, trembling, uncertain where to land. She took them. She placed them on her waist. They were enormous there, spanning nearly the full width of her, warm and shaking. "Try me," she whispered. His control snapped tight like a rope pulled to its breaking point. He lifted her gently with a care that seemed to cost him physical effort and set her back on her feet in front of him. He was breathing hard. His hands had left her waist the moment her feet touched the floor. "I am too big for you," he said. His voice was rough in ways that carried meaning far beyond the words themselves, in ways that matter. The rejection hit her fast and hot. Her face burned. "You think I am weak? I think you deserve more than being overpowered." She stepped back. "You think I cannot choose? I think you have had choice stolen from you enough." Silence fell between them with the weight of a dropped stone. She turned away, swallowing hard against the sting in her throat. That night she lay facing the wall. He sat in the chair. The distance between them hummed with everything that had been said and everything that had not. In the morning she found him outside building something against the far wall of the cabin. A frame, made of fresh-cut pine. The shape was unmistakable. A second bed. Her stomach twisted. She stood in the doorway and watched him work, watched the way his big hands moved over the wood with the same care he brought to everything, and she felt something rise inside her that was not sadness and not anger, but something fiercer than both. She walked back inside without speaking. When he came through the door, carrying planks, she was standing in the middle of the room, waiting. "You are building distance," she said. He met her eyes. "I do not want you to feel cornered." Something inside her snapped, not gently, not like a thread giving way, like a bone breaking and resetting itself in the same instant, coming back together stronger than it was before. She grabbed the axe from the woodpile. She walked straight to the half-built frame, and before he could react, she swung. The first strike split one board clean through. The crack rang through the cabin like a gunshot. "Elara!" His voice carried warning but not command. She swung again. "I will not sleep like a guest." The second board splintered. "I will not live like I am passing through." The third blow brought the frame down in a crash of broken pine and bent nails. She stood breathing hard, her chest rising fast, her hair falling across her face, the axe still in her hands. She looked at him with eyes that were not asking permission. "I stay because I want to," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else." Boone looked at the wreckage of the bed frame. Then he looked at her. And slowly, like sunrise moving across a valley, something that looked remarkably like pride moved across his face. He stepped forward. Not close enough to trap, just close enough to be present. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted. "Neither do I." That honesty settled between them like the first clean snow of winter, pure, untracked, full of possibility. And then from outside a sound cut through the quiet. Not wind, not branches, hooves, not one horse, 3, coming through the trees with the steady pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. Both of them heard it at the same time. Boone moved first. He grabbed the rifle from the rack on the wall. Elara grabbed the revolver from the shelf. They stood side by side at the window and looked out through the narrow glass into the white world beyond. Upon returning to the cabin before heading to Dawson's, Elara quickly retrieved the revolver Boone had given her from the shelf, no longer seeing it as his spare tool, but as her own means of survival. 3 riders broke through the tree line into the clearing in front of the cabin. The horses were dark-breathing hard steam rising from their flanks. The lead rider was dressed in a brown mink coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and he sat his horse with the easy posture of a man who was accustomed to being in charge of whatever situation he entered. To his left rode a man so large that his horse seemed to sag beneath him, thick-necked and blank-faced, with hands that hung at his sides like slabs of meat. To his right sat a thin man with quick eyes that moved over the cabin and the woodpile and the tracks in the snow with the efficiency of someone cataloging evidence. Elara's blood went cold. She recognized the man in front instantly. She would have recognized him in total darkness by the sound of his breathing, by the particular way his weight shifted in a saddle, by the smell of mink and whiskey, and something underneath. Both that she had never been able to name, but that made her skin crawl every time she was near it. Judson Crail, the man who had bought her contract, the man who had added debt every time she breathed, the man who had heated an iron in the shape of the letter K and pressed it into the skin of her shoulder while 2 men held her down, and he smiled. "He found me," she whispered. Boone's voice turned to steel. The transformation was instant and total, as if someone had taken the quiet man who carved wooden birds and replaced him with something older and harder and infinitely more dangerous. "Go to the back room." "No. Elara. I am not hiding." The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards from the cabin. He looked at the building the way a man looks at a house he is considering purchasing, appraising, calculating. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been looking for something and has found it exactly where he expected it to be. He dismounted slowly. His boots crunched in the snow. He adjusted his coat, brushed a flake of ice from his sleeve, and looked directly at the window where Elara's silhouette was visible through the glass. "Clara!" he called out, using the name she had been given in his ledger, the name that was not hers and never had been. His voice was light, almost pleasant, the voice of a man calling a dog that has slipped its leash. "You run far for a girl who belongs to me." Boone stepped onto the porch. The rifle was in his hands, but not raised. Not yet. His presence in the doorway was its own statement. 6 feet 5 inches of mountain man filling the frame like a wall made of flesh and bone. "She does not belong to anyone," he said. Crayley looked at him with the mild interest of a man examining an obstacle that he has not yet decided how to remove. "You are sheltering stolen property, cowboy." "She is not property." Crayle's smile did not waver, but his eyes changed. They went flat and still, the way a snake's eyes go flat right before it strikes. "She signed a contract. She owes a debt. The law is the law." Elara stepped out beside Boone. The revolver was in her hand, pointed at the ground but visible. Her hand was not shaking. She was aware of this fact with a clarity that felt almost supernatural, as if she were watching herself from a distance and marveling at the steadiness of this woman who had spent 2 years trembling at the sound of this man's voice. "I am not yours," she said. Her voice carried across the snow clear and hard, and she did not recognize it as her own. Crayle's smile faded, not entirely. Just enough to show the edge of something underneath it that was not amused and had never been amused and was in fact the furthest thing from amusement that a human face could produce. "You think hiding behind him changes anything?" he said. The large man to Crayle's left gentry moved his hand toward his holster with the slow deliberation of a man who has done this many times. Boone raised the rifle. The motion was smooth and fast, and by the time Gentry's fingers touched his gun grip, the barrel was already leveled at his chest. Crayle lifted one hand, and Gentry stopped. Just like that. No words necessary. The gesture of a man whose authority was absolute, and whose men knew it. "Careful," Crayle said softly, looking at Boone. "You do not know who you are standing against." Boone's voice did not change. "I do not care." The tension stretched thin as wire between them. The wind picked up swirling loose snow around their boots, carrying the cold across the space between the cabin and the horsemen like a messenger running between armies. Crayle studied Boone for a long moment. His eyes moved over the rifle the way Boone held it, the width of his shoulders, the steadiness of his hands. He was calculating odds. He was a man who always calculated odds before he acted, and the odds at this particular moment with a rifle aimed at his man, and another gun in the woman's hands, and a mountain man who looked like he had been built specifically for violence, standing between him and what he wanted, were not in his favor. He turned his gaze to Elara. "You will come back," he said. "When he realizes you are more trouble than you are worth, you will come crawling back. They always do." Elara stepped forward, one step, toward the man who had branded her. "I would rather freeze." Something dark passed over Crayle's face, a shadow that was there and gone so quickly that if you blinked, you would have missed it. The shadow of a man who is not accustomed to being told no and who does not intend to get accustomed to it. He mounted his horse slowly with the careful movements of a man who wants to make it clear that he is leaving by choice and not because he has been driven off. He settled into the saddle and gathered the reins and looked down at Boone and Elara from the height of the horse with the expression of a man looking at something he fully intends to come back for. "This is not finished," he said. He turned his horse and rode back toward the trees. Gentry and Polk followed. The sound of hooves faded into the forest, and then into the wind, and then into the silence that settled over the clearing like a held breath. Boone did not lower the rifle until the sound was completely gone. Only then did he exhale. The breath came out of him in a long white stream, and in that breath was all the tension he had been holding in his body since the first hoofbeat reached his ears. Elara felt her knees give way. Not dramatically, not with a cry, but simply the quiet surrender of legs that had been locked in place by willpower alone and had reached their limit. Boone caught her before she reached the ground. His arm went around her waist and held her upright, and she turned into him and pressed her face against his chest, and he could feel her shaking, trembling so hard it was as though she were standing in a wind that only she could feel. He held her, not gently, not at a distance. He held her the way you hold something you have decided to protect with the full weight of your body and the full strength of your arms, and she leaned into him and let herself be held. And for the first time in her life, she understood the difference between being grabbed and being caught. For a moment it felt like victory. For a moment the quiet after Crail's departure felt like safety. But Boone knew better. And 2 hours later, riding south through the pines toward Elk Crossing, Judson Crail was already making plans that proved Boone right. Crail turned to Polk, who rode at his right side. "Send word to Judge Fletcher. Tell him to come early, and hire 3 more guns from Butte. Good ones." Polk nodded. "And the mountain man?" Crail smiled. But this time the smile had no warmth in it, no performance, no mask. It was the real thing underneath all the other smiles. The smile of a predator that has located its prey and is in no particular hurry. "Next time," Crail said, "we do not talk." 2 days passed, and in those 2 days Judson Crail demonstrated exactly why he was more dangerous than a man with a gun. A man with a gun could be outshot. A man with money and connections and the patient cruelty of a chess player could dismantle your life one piece at a time without ever coming within rifle range. Boone rode to old Dawson's place on the 2nd day. Dawson was a trapper who lived alone in a cabin half a day's ride from Boone's, a man of 67 years who had survived more Montana winters than anyone else in the territory, and who communicated primarily through silences of varying length and the occasional grunt. He was the closest thing Boone had to a friend, which said something about both of them. When Boone arrived, the feed shed behind Dawson's cabin was a smoking ruin. Charred timbers jutting from the snow like black bones. The old man sat on a stump in front of the wreckage, a cut on his cheekbone, his rifle across his knees. "2 of them," Dawson said without preamble. "Came yesterday, asked about a girl. I said I did not know anything. They burned the shed and left." Boone felt the anger rise, the familiar anger, the cold one. The one that did not shout or shake but simply filled him up from the bottom like water filling a well, cold and heavy and patient. His hands made fists, his jaw locked. Dawson looked at him with the calm, appraising eyes of a man who had lived long enough to recognize the signs. "Do not become the thing you are running from, Boone." He released his fists, helped Dawson clear the debris, rode home. But the anger stayed sitting in his chest like a stone that would not dissolve no matter how many times he breathed through it. In Elk Crossing, the assault continued by different means. Boone rode to the general store to buy ammunition. The man behind the counter, a fellow named Hewitt, who had sold Boone supplies for 3 years without incident, shook his head before Boone could speak. "Cannot do it," Hewitt said, and his eyes went to the floor and stayed there. "Crail sent word. Anyone who helps you or that girl will have trouble. I have a family Calloway." Boone stood in the store and looked at Hewitt, and Hewitt looked at the floor, and the silence between them was the silence of a community that had decided that self-preservation was worth more than justice. Boone walked out without buying anything. On the street, people turned their faces away as he passed, not with hostility, with shame. They knew what Crail was. They knew what he did to the women in his custody. They knew about the contracts and the debts that never decreased and the brand in the shape of a letter. They knew, and they were too afraid to say it out loud, and Boone understood this because fear was a language he spoke fluently, and he recognized its grammar in the averted eyes and the closed doors and the sudden busyness of people who had been idle a moment ago. Crail did not just have gunmen. He had something more effective. He had an entire town's silence. On the road out of Elk Crossing, a woman stepped from behind a stand of aspens and blocked Boone's horse. She was young, 22 maybe, thin in the way of women who worked too hard and ate too little. Her hair was brown and pulled back from a face that was sharp-featured and serious and carried the particular kind of hardness that comes from being hurt enough times that softness feels like a luxury you cannot afford. "My name is Nettie Greer," she said. "I know about the girl you are keeping. I know Crail will not stop. I know this because he did the same to me." Boone studied her. "What do you want?" "To help." "It is dangerous." "I know what dangerous is." She pulled the collar of her dress aside, and there on her collarbone, a brand. The letter K inside a circle. Same shape, same scar, same man. "There are not just 2 of us," she said. "There are at least 6. That is how many names I counted when I was in his house. 6 girls. Some got out. Some did not." Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Follow me." He brought Nettie back to Dawson's cabin where Alara was waiting. The 2 women faced each other across the small room, and no one needed to say anything. Nettie pulled her collar aside. Alara pulled her shirt from her shoulder. The same mark, the same letter, the same iron heated by the same hand and pressed into their skin by the same man who smiled while he did it. "How many?" Alara asked. "At least 6 that I know of. Some escaped. Some he sold. Some are still there." Alara's face went tight. The information settled into her like a weight being added to a scale, tipping the balance from fear toward something else, toward the understanding that this was not about her alone. It had never been about her alone. And then Alara told the rest of her story, the parts she had not told Boone, the parts she had been carrying alone because speaking them out loud would make them real in a way that thinking them did not. She told them about the contract, how her father Walter Whitmore had signed it after Crail's men beat him in the kitchen of their farmhouse in Nebraska, how they held his hand over the paper and forced the pen between his fingers. How she was 17 when they put her in a wagon and drove her to Montana, and how the word bride was on the contract, but there was no wedding and no husband and no marriage of any kind. She told them about the room with the locked door, about the work in the saloon that started before sunrise and ended after midnight, about the debt that grew every day because Crail charged for everything: food, shelter, clothing, protection, the air she breathed if he could have found a way to put a price on it. She told them something she had not told Boone. The reason she remained unharmed was not due to mercy. Crail viewed her as mint-condition stock, a premium asset he kept isolated to ensure the highest price from his client in Virginia City. "The night before I was supposed to be delivered," Alara said, and her voice was steady, now steady in the way that water is steady when it has found its level and will not be moved. "I stole a horse from his stable, and I rode north. The horse died on the pass. I found the wagon, I crawled underneath it, and then you found me." She looked at Boone. He was very still. His face had not changed expression during the entire telling, but his hands were gripped so tightly on the edge of the table that the wood was creaking. "The mine owner already paid," Nettie added quietly. "Crail owes him. That is why he will not stop. It is not pride, it is money. If he does not deliver her, the mine owner will come for him." Boone breathed out slowly through his nose. The anger was there, the cold, familiar anger. But this time something else was there too. Something that looked like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the whole picture and understand that the picture is worse than you imagined, but also simpler. "She is not going back," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact delivered in the same tone he used to describe the weather or the condition of his traps. The sky is gray. The creek is frozen. She is not going back. What happened next was the thing that changed everything. Boone left the cabin at dawn to check the far trap line, the one that took him 3 hours out and 3 hours back. He told Alara he would return before midday. He kissed her forehead before he left, a gesture so natural that neither of them remarked on it, a gesture that had become part of the language they were building between them, word by word, touch by touch. He was wrong about midday. The far traps had been disturbed by wolves, and the reset took longer than expected. By the time he reached the ridge above the cabin, the sun was past its peak and dropping toward the western mountains. The cabin door was open, not ajar. Open, swinging gently in the wind, the way a door swings when it has been left open in a hurry by people who did not care about closing it behind them. Boone ran. He covered the distance between the ridge and the cabin in minutes that felt like hours. He burst through the door, and the room was empty. The fire was still burning. The cup of water she had been drinking from was still on the table, still warm when he pressed his hand against it. On the floor, boot prints in mud. 2 sets, large, male, and in the wood of the door frame, 4 deep scratches gouged by fingernails. She had fought. She had clawed at the doorway as they dragged her out. She had not gone quietly. The tracks in the snow told the rest. 2 horses. A third set of prints between them, smaller, stumbling, the prints of someone being forced to walk between mounted riders. The trail headed southeast toward the abandoned logging camp 3 hours down the valley. Boone stood in the empty cabin and felt the anger come. Not the cold anger this time. Something worse. Something older. The anger that had come the night Emmett died. The anger that had turned his hands into instruments of death and his mind into a blank white space where nothing existed except the next movement and the next and the next. His hands found the door frame where her fingernails had gouged 4 deep lines into the wood. He gripped it until the timber groaned and sawdust fell from the joints. The anger arrived not in a wave, but in a flood, filling every hollow inside him, the way winter fills a valley, silent and total and without mercy. He closed his eyes. He breathed through his nose until the roaring in his skull faded to a hum. He opened his eyes. The old darkness was there, patient as ever. The place where killing was easy and feeling was impossible, and the only thing that mattered was the destruction of whatever was in front of you. Do not become the thing you are running from. Dawson's words. Her words. His own words written in charcoal in a leather journal on nights when the darkness felt close enough to touch. He released the door frame. He opened his hands. He looked at them, at the calluses and the scars and the size of them, and he made a choice. Not the easy choice, the hard one. He went inside. He took the rifle. He took the spare revolver. He took his hunting knife and a length of rope. He checked the ammunition. He put on his coat. Every action deliberate, every movement controlled. Not because he was calm, but because he was refusing to let the anger make his decisions for him. Then he followed the tracks into the trees. He found them at the logging camp as the light was fading. Gentry was sitting outside an abandoned shack smoking a cigarette, his horse tied to a pine stump nearby. Through the gaps in the plank walls, Boone could see the shape of a woman tied to a support post inside. He waited until the cigarette was almost done. Then he moved. Boone moved like a shadow, neutralizing the guard before he could utter a sound. Within moments, the man was unconscious and bound to a nearby tree. Not dead, unconscious. Boone checked his pulse, confirmed he was breathing, and tied him to the pine stump with enough rope to hold a horse. He did not kill him. He wanted to. The wanting was right there, so close he could taste it, metallic and sharp at the back of his throat. But he did not. He went inside. Elara was tied to the post with her hands behind her back. A new bruise darkened her left cheek where Gentry had struck her when she fought back. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady when she saw him. "Took you long enough?" she said. He cut the ropes. He knelt in front of her and checked her wrists, her face, the bruise on her cheek. His fingers hovered near the mark but did not touch it. "I am sorry," he said. "You found me. That is what matters." He looked at her bruise, and she saw it. For the first time she saw the full depth of what lived inside Boone Calloway. The anger. Not the controlled version he showed the world. The real thing underneath. Cold and vast and utterly without mercy, the anger of a man who had killed with his bare hands and knew he could do it again and was choosing in this moment with every fiber of his being not to. "Do not," she said softly. "Do not become that thing because of me." A long breath. A nod, slow, deliberate. "Let us go," he said. They rode through the night, not back to the cabin. Boone knew it was compromised. He rode instead to Dawson's place, where the old man opened his door without surprise and without questions, and said only, "The barn still has room." In the barn, wrapped in blankets by the light of a single oil lamp, Elora and Boone sat together in the hay. Her head rested against his shoulder. His arm was around her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "You could take me west," she said finally. "Oregon, California, somewhere he would never find me." "I could. But he would find someone else. There would always be another girl." Silence. Nettie said she would stand up too, if I went first. "Stand up," Boone repeated. "In front of the whole town. Say everything. In front of the law." She was quiet for a moment. Boone could feel her breathing against his side, the rise and fall of her ribs, the small movements of a body that was alive and warm and pressed against him by choice. "If I stay quiet," she said, "he keeps doing it." "Yes. And if I speak, it might change things. It might not. But someone will hear." She looked at her hands. Hands that had once shaken so badly she could not hold a cup of broth without spilling it. Hands that could now split a log and load a revolver and hold steady enough to put a bullet within a hand's width of center at 30 paces. "I will do it," she said. "You are sure?" "No," she admitted. "But I am done running." Outside, snow fell softly on the barn roof, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Inside, two people who had spent their lives learning to survive alone sat together in the hay and made a decision that would require them to be something neither of them had ever been. Together. And somewhere to the south, in a warm room behind a saloon in Elk Crossing, Judson Creel poured himself a whiskey and opened a letter that had arrived by courier that afternoon. The handwriting was careful. The signature at the bottom read, "Morton Fletcher, Territorial Judge." "Arriving tomorrow," the letter said. "Have the papers ready." Creel folded the letter and placed it in the ledger beside the 6 names and the running debts and the word "sold." He leaned back in his chair and drank his whiskey and smiled at the ceiling. Tomorrow the law would be on his side. Tomorrow the mountain man would learn that in Montana strength meant nothing if you did not have paper to back it up. And tomorrow the girl with the brand on her shoulder would learn what every girl before her had learned. That nobody leaves Judson Creel. He was wrong about that, but he did not know it yet. And neither did the man on the mountain who was at that very moment cleaning his rifle and making a promise to himself that he would keep his hands open and his anger leashed, and his word to the woman sleeping beside him, the promise that he would not kill unless there was no other choice. It was the hardest promise he had ever made, and in the morning it would be tested. Boone Calloway rode into Elk Crossing alone at first light. The town was barely awake. Smoke drifted from a few chimneys along the main street, thin gray columns rising into a sky the color of old pewter. The general store was shuttered. The blacksmith's forge was cold. A dog lay curled on the porch of the feed store, lifting its head as Boone passed, and then lowering it again, as if it had already decided he was not worth the effort of barking at. The sheriff's office sat at the end of the street, a squat building of unpainted timber with a single window facing the road. A faded star was nailed above the door, the paint chipped and weathered, but still visible enough to serve its purpose. This was where the law lived in Elk Crossing, such as it was. Boone dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. He stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk and looked down the empty street in both directions. He was not looking for danger. He was looking at a town that had decided collectively and quietly to be afraid. And he was asking himself whether what he was about to do would change that or simply give them something new to be afraid of. He pushed open the door. Sheriff Harlan Pruitt sat behind a desk that was too small for a man his size. He was 58 years old and built like a man who had spent the first half of his life doing physical labor and the second half sitting behind desks and regretting the transition. His hair had gone gray in the way that iron goes gray, not gradually, but in patches, as if time had attacked it in stages and been resisted at each one. His beard was trimmed close, more gray than brown, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen the territory at its worst and had decided to keep looking anyway. He was drinking coffee from a tin cup when Boone walked in. He set the cup down but did not stand. "Calloway," he said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Sheriff?" "Sit down." "I will stand." Pruitt studied him for a moment with the unhurried attention of a lawman who has learned to measure trouble by the look in a man's eyes before the first word is spoken. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You are here about the girl." "I am here about Judson Crale." "Same thing." Boone told him. Not everything. Not the parts about what was happening between himself and Alara, because those parts belonged to them and were not currency to be spent in a sheriff's office. But the rest. The contract signed under duress. The girl taken at 17. The debt that grew like a weed no matter how much work was done to pay it down. The brand on her shoulder. The letter K burned into living skin. Pruitt's face did not change during the telling, but his hand went still on the cup and stayed still. When Boone finished, the silence lasted long enough for the coffee to stop steaming. "Branding," Pruitt said. The word came out like a stone being placed on a scale. "Like cattle. I have heard rumors about Crale's operations. Rumors are not evidence. She will testify. In front of witnesses. She will show the brand." Pruitt rubbed his jaw. "That changes things. But you should know something. Fletcher arrived this morning." The name landed in Boone's chest like a fist. Morton Fletcher, territorial judge, Crale's man in the system, the legal weight behind the paper chains. "Crale filed a complaint against you," Pruitt continued. "Assault on his employee, interference with a labor contract, harboring a debtor. Fletcher was ready to issue a warrant before breakfast. And you stopped him." "I told him this is my county, and cases in my county go through my office before they go anywhere else." He was not pleased. Boone looked at Pruitt. "Will you stand behind that?" The sheriff picked up his coffee, looked into it, set it down again. "Here is what I know. Crale's contracts are thin as paper in winter rain. Most are signed under threat. Half of them would not survive a real court in a real city with a real judge. But Fletcher is not a real judge. He is Crale's judge, and if this hearing happens under Fletcher's authority, your girl goes back to Crale and you go to jail. So it has to happen under yours. Yes, tomorrow morning. Early. I will call a public hearing. Crale can present his papers. She can present her testimony. The town will be there. Fletcher can watch, but he will not preside. He will try to take over. Let him try." For the first time, something that was not weariness appeared in Pruitt's eyes. Something harder, something older. The look of a man who had watched his jurisdiction become a playground for men with money and had finally found the thing that made him angry enough to push back. "Bring her," Pruitt said. "Bring whoever else you have. And bring evidence. Testimony is powerful, but testimony with proof is a wall that even Crale cannot climb over." Boone nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Sheriff." "What?" "Thank you." Pruitt picked up his coffee. "Do not thank me yet." That night was the longest of Boone Calloway's life. He rode back to Dawson's place in the dying light and told Alara what Pruitt had said. She listened without interrupting, her face going through a series of changes that were visible only if you knew where to look. A tightening at the corners of her mouth, a slight narrowing of her eyes, the smallest shift in her posture from leaning back to leaning forward. "Tomorrow morning," she repeated. "Yes." "In front of everyone." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind was gentle for once, moving through the pines with a sound like slow breathing. "Then I need something first," she said. "Name it." "I need you to go back to his place, to the saloon. Find his brown leather ledger. Crale is a man of rigid habits. If he hasn't moved it, it will still be locked in the heavy oak desk in his private back room. Brown leather, brass clasp. Every girl's name is in it, every debt, every sale. If I stand up and just talk, it is my word against his. If you bring that book, it is proof." Boone looked at her for a long time. What she was asking was not small. It meant riding into Elk Crossing at night, breaking into Crail's private office, and taking evidence that Crail would kill to protect. It meant risk. Real risk. The kind that ended with a bullet or a noose. "I will go," he said. "It is dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous." Nettie, who had been listening from the corner, spoke up. "I know the layout. I can tell you where the guards will be. There is a window in the back that does not latch properly. I used it once when I escaped." Dawson, leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, said nothing for a long time. Then he grunted. "I will go with you. 2 sets of eyes. 1 to watch, 1 to work." Boone looked at the old man. "You do not owe me anything." "No, but I owe myself. I have been sitting on this mountain pretending the world down there is not my problem. Man gets tired of pretending." They left after midnight. Boone and Dawson rode south through the dark timber, following trails that Dawson had traveled for decades and could navigate blindfolded. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough light to see by, which suited their purpose exactly. Elk Crossing was dead at this hour. No lamplight in any window. The saloon was dark, the front door locked, the windows shuttered. Dawson positioned himself at the corner of the building where he could see both the front entrance and the alley that led to the back. 20 minutes, Dawson said. "If you are not out in 20, I am coming in." Boone went around back. The window Nettie had described was there, a small pane of glass set into the wall of the back room, and when he pressed against it, the latch gave way with a sound no louder than a breath. He slid the window open and climbed inside. The room smelled of whiskey and cigar smoke, and something underneath both that he recognized as the smell of transactions conducted in private. The desk was large, dark wood, expensive. He pulled the drawer, and it resisted. Locked. He took his knife and worked the blade into the gap between the drawer and the frame, and levered until the lock gave way with a crack that sounded in the silence of the empty building like a gunshot. Inside was the ledger. Brown leather. Brass clasp. Exactly as Alara had described. He opened it. 6 names in neat columns. Dates of acquisition. Running totals of debt. And beside each name in Crail's careful handwriting a single word and a dollar amount. Sold, 300. Sold, 450. Sold, 200. And beside Alara's name, reserved, 700. Virginia City. Delivery pending. Boone closed the ledger and put it inside his coat. He was halfway back to the window when the floorboard beneath his right foot creaked loud and sharp. He froze, listened. Somewhere in the building a chair scraped, then footsteps, then silence. He did not wait to find out who was awake. He went through the window, dropped to the ground, and moved to where Dawson was waiting. "Got it," Boone said. "Good, because someone just lit a lamp upstairs." They rode hard and did not slow down until the lights of Elk Crossing were far behind them, and the only sound was hooves on frozen ground and the wind in the pines. Back at Dawson's cabin, Boone set the ledger on the table and opened it in the lamplight. Alara, Nettie, and Dawson gathered around it. Alara ran her finger down the column of names. Her name was there. Nettie's was there. 4 others they did not know. 6 women, Alara said. 6. Nettie pointed to one name near the top. "That is Mary Haddon. She was there when I was. She did not make it out." Nobody spoke for a moment. The ledger sat on the table between them. Its pages yellowed and creased, its contents laid out with the mundane precision of a man who tracked his finances the same way whether he was selling grain or selling human beings. Alara closed the ledger and looked at Boone. "Now we have proof. Now we have proof." She looked at the window where the sky was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. Dawn was coming, and with it the hearing that would decide everything. "I need to sleep," she said, "even if it is only for an hour." She lay down on the cot in Dawson's cabin and closed her eyes. Boone sat beside her on the floor, his back against the wall, the rifle across his knees. He watched her face as the tension slowly drained from it, the muscles around her eyes relaxing, her breathing deepening, her lips parting slightly as sleep finally took her. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She did not stir. His hand lingered near her face for a moment, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin without touching it. "If this does not work," he said very quietly to himself more than to her, "I will take you west. I will take you so far that his name becomes a word in a language no one speaks." She slept. He watched the door. The sky grew lighter. And in less than 2 hours, everything they had built and everything they had survived would come down to a woman's voice in a small room, and whether the people who heard it would choose courage over fear. They rode into Elk Crossing as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. 4 of them. Boone on his gray gelding, Ilara beside him on a mare borrowed from Dawson, Nettie riding behind them on a mule, and Dawson bringing up the rear on his old bay, because, as he put it, he did not have anything better to do, and a man should not die without having attended at least one event that mattered. People stared. Of course they stared. A mountain man the size of a barn door riding into town with 2 women and an old trapper was not the kind of procession Elk Crossing saw every morning. Whispers followed them down the street like smoke following a draft curling around corners and through open doorways and into the ears of every person who had spent the past week pretending they did not know what Judson Creel did behind closed doors. Ilara felt every eye on her skin. She kept her back straight and her chin up and her hands steady on the reins, and if the effort cost her something, she did not let it show. Boone rode beside her close enough that their stirrups nearly touched, and he did not look at the townspeople. He looked straight ahead at the courthouse at the end of the street, at the place where this would end one way or another. Creel was already there. Standing in front of the saloon, his mink coat brushed his hat clean, his posture radiating the relaxed confidence of a man who has already won and is merely attending the ceremony. To his left stood 2 gunmen Boone had not seen before, hired hands from Butte, hard-faced and professionally indifferent. To his right, slightly behind him, stood Judge Morton Fletcher, a round man in a dark suit with gold spectacles that caught the morning sun, his face wearing the carefully neutral expression of someone who has been paid to arrive at a specific conclusion and does not wish to appear as though he is rushing toward it. Creel watched Ilara dismount. His eyes tracked her the way a cat tracks a mouse that has wandered back into a room it had previously escaped from. He smiled. "You came back," he said. "Not for you," she replied. The hearing room was the town hall, a single large room with plank walls and a low ceiling and windows on 2 sides that let in the gray morning light. Pruitt had set up his desk at the front. Reverend Thomas Ashby stood near the wall, tall and thin, and grave his Bible in his hand, present as a witness of moral authority. The benches were filled, every seat taken, people standing along the walls. The entire population of Elk Crossing had turned out not because they cared about justice, but because they wanted to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. Pruitt called the room to order. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of a man who had decided that this particular morning was the one that would define the remainder of his career and possibly his life. Fletcher moved first. He stood from his seat in the front row and adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. "As territorial judge," he began, "I have jurisdiction over contract disputes within the Montana Territory, and I—" "Sit down, Fletcher." Pruitt did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This is my county. Cases in my county begin in my office. You are welcome to observe." Fletcher's face went red. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at Creel, who gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, the gesture of a chess player conceding a pawn to protect a queen. Fletcher sat down. Creel rose. He buttoned his coat, walked to the front of the room, and placed a document on Pruitt's desk with the careful precision of a man laying down a winning hand. "The facts are simple," he said. His voice was smooth and measured. The voice of a man making a business presentation, not the voice of a man defending the purchase and enslavement of human beings. "Miss Clara Whitmore entered into a labor contract with my establishment in April of 1881. The contract stipulates that she will work in my employ until her family's debt of $320 is repaid. She has not repaid it. She fled my custody 2 weeks ago. Additionally, This man," he pointed at Boone, "assaulted one of my employees and forcibly removed Miss Whitmore from a recovery operation. I am asking for the return of my contracted worker and the arrest of Boone Calloway for assault and theft of labor." He sat down. The room was quiet. Crail had presented his case with the confidence of a man who has done this before and won every time. Pruitt looked at the document. Then he looked at Alara. "Miss Whitmore." She stood. The room went silent. Not the silence of people who are paying attention. The silence of people who are holding their breath. She walked to the front of the room. She was wearing the wool shirt Boone had given her the first night, the one that hung to her knees, and she had belted it at the waist with a strip of leather, and her hair was pulled back from her face, and she looked in that moment like what she was, a young woman who had survived things that would have killed someone with less steel in their spine, standing in front of a room full of strangers and preparing to tell them the worst things that had ever happened to her. Her voice shook when she began. She did not try to stop it from shaking. She let it shake and spoke through it anyway. "My father signed that contract after Crail's men beat him in our kitchen," she said. "They held his hand over the paper. I was 17 years old. I did not agree to anything. I was taken." Murmurs moved through the room like wind through wheat. There was no wedding. There was no marriage. There was a locked room and work that started before sunrise and ended after midnight, and there was a debt that grew every day. He charged me for food, for the bed I slept on, for the clothes I wore, for the privilege of being alive inside his building. Every day I breathed was a day I owed him more. Her voice grew steadier with every sentence, not louder, steadier, as if each word she spoke removed a weight from her chest and allowed the next word to come more easily. She looked at Boone. He was standing against the wall near the door arms at his sides, his face unreadable to anyone who did not know him. But she knew him, and in his eyes she saw the thing she needed to see. A single small nod, almost invisible, a nod that said, "I am here. Keep going." "When I tried to run the second time," she said, and her voice went very quiet, so quiet that the people in the back row leaned forward to hear, "He punished me." She reached up and pulled the collar of the wool shirt aside, sliding it down over her left shoulder. The brand was visible to the entire room. The letter K inside a circle, raised and scarred, burned into the skin just below her collarbone. The sound that went through the room was not a gasp. It was something deeper than a gasp. It was the collective intake of breath of 50 people who had suspected something ugly and were now seeing it confirmed in scarred flesh. A woman in the second row put her hand over her mouth. A man near the window looked away and then forced himself to look back. "He branded me," Alara said, "like livestock. He made sure I could never forget who he was. I was trapped helpless while he claimed his ownership with a cold smile." Crail shifted in his seat. "That is a disciplinary mark," he said, and his voice had lost some of its smoothness, not much, but enough that Boone noticed. "Common practice for contracted workers who violate—" "I have not finished," Alara said, and the way she said it, the quiet authority of it, the refusal to be interrupted by the man who had burned his initial into her body, silenced Crail more effectively than a shout would have. Ashby stepped forward. His face was pale, the face of a man whose faith has just been confronted with evidence of evil that his theology acknowledges but his heart is not prepared for. "Branding a woman," he said, his voice carrying the particular weight of moral certainty that belongs to men of the cloth when they choose to wield it, "is not contract law, it is not discipline, it is savagery." Pruitt looked at Crail. Crail's smile was still there, but it had become a fixed thing, plastered on, maintained by willpower rather than confidence. "Miss Greer," Pruitt said. Nettie stood. She walked to the front of the room with the measured steps of a woman who had rehearsed this walk in her mind 100 times and was determined to do it right. She did not look at Crail. She looked at Alara, and Alara looked back, and between them passed something that did not need words and could not have been improved by them. "My name is Nettie Greer," she said. "I was held by Judson Crail for 2 years, from 1880 to 1882, under the same conditions, the same debt, the same locked room, the same work. She pulled her collar aside. On her collarbone the same brand, the same letter, the same circle, the same scar made by the same iron heated in the same fire by the same hand. The room erupted, not in anger, in the sound of a community that has been keeping a secret from itself and can no longer maintain the pretense. Voices overlapped. Chairs scraped. Fletcher's face had gone the color of old cheese, and he was looking at the door with the expression of a man calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Pruitt let the noise continue for 10 seconds, then he brought his palm down flat on the desk. Once. The room went quiet. "I have one more piece of evidence," Pruitt said. He reached beneath his desk and brought out the ledger. Brown leather, brass clasp. He opened it and began to read. Names, dates, debts that increased without explanation, and beside each name in neat handwriting that everyone in the room recognized as belonging to a man who prided himself on careful record-keeping, the word that turned a contract dispute into a criminal enterprise. Sold. Mary Haddon, $300. Sold. Nettie Greer, $275. Reserved. Elara Whitmore, $700. Virginia City. Delivery pending. This, Pruitt said, holding up the ledger so the room could see it, is not a payroll. It is not a debt record. It is a bill of sale for human beings. Crail stood up fast. His chair fell backward and clattered against the floor. "That was stolen from my private property," he said, and for the first time his voice had risen above its careful, modulated smoothness. "He broke into my office." He pointed at Boone. "That is inadmissible. That is theft. That Pruitt said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has found the line he will not allow to be crossed, and is standing on it with both feet, is evidence of trafficking in human beings. And it was found in your office because that is where you kept the records of your crimes." Crail looked around the room. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for an ally, a sympathizer, someone who owed him a favor or feared him enough to speak up. He found nothing. The faces that looked back at him were the faces of people who had been afraid for years and were in this moment slightly less afraid of him than they were ashamed of their own silence. His hired gunmen stood near the door. They looked at each other. One of them shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The other looked at the floor. Neither of them moved to help. They had been hired to intimidate farmers and chase down runaway women, not to stand against a room full of witnesses and a sheriff with evidence and a mountain man who looked like he had been carved from the same stone as the mountains outside. Fletcher sat very still in his chair. He had not spoken since Pruitt told him to sit down. His gold spectacles reflected the window light, and his hands were folded in his lap with the exaggerated stillness of a man who is trying very hard to be invisible. He had made his calculation. The calculation was complete. He would not be helping Judson Crail today or any other day. Pruitt picked up the contract from his desk, the one Crail had placed there with such confidence at the beginning of the hearing. He held it up. "No legal witness," he said. "No seal. Signed under duress by a man who was beaten in his own kitchen while his 17-year-old daughter watched." He took the paper in both hands and tore it in half. The sound was sharp and clean and final, and it echoed off the plank walls of the town hall like a rifle shot. "Debt voided," Pruitt said. "Contract nullified." The room exhaled. 50 people breathed out at the same time, and the sound of it was like wind. Crail's face had gone a shade of red that Boone had only seen on men who were about to do something they could not take back. His hands were at his sides, and the fingers of his right hand were curling and uncurling in a rhythm that Boone recognized because it was the same rhythm his own fingers made when the cold anger was building and the control was slipping. "You think this is finished?" Crail said. His voice was quiet again, but the quietness was different now. It was the quietness of something pressed flat, compressed, ready to spring. "For you," Pruitt said, "it is." Crail looked around the room one more time. He looked at Fletcher, who would not meet his eyes. He looked at his gunmen, who had taken a step closer to the door. He looked at the townspeople who looked back with the tentative defiance of people discovering that they are braver in numbers than they ever were alone. Then he looked at Alara, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen there before. Not calculation, not confidence, not the measured cruelty of a man who controls everything around him. What she saw was hatred, pure and uncut and personal. The hatred of a man who has been beaten in public by someone he considered his property and whose pride is now a wound that nothing will ever heal. He turned and walked toward the door. His steps were slow and deliberate, the walk of a man who wants the room to know that he is leaving by choice. He reached the doorway. He stopped. He turned around. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but for everyone in that room the 3 seconds expanded into something much longer. The way time expands when the body's survival mechanisms override the brain's ability to process events at normal speed. Crail's right hand moved to his left sleeve. A blade appeared short and bright, the kind of knife a man carries when he wants to be armed without appearing armed. He pivoted on his heel and lunged, not toward Pruitt, not toward the gunman or the door or any logical target, toward Alara, directly toward the woman who had stood in front of this room and showed the mark he had put on her body and said his name out loud and made him small in front of people he had spent years training to fear him. 2 things happened simultaneously. Boone moved. He crossed the space between the wall and Alara in a motion that should not have been possible for a man his size, but the body does not consult physics when it is protecting something it cannot afford to lose. He stepped between Crail and Alara and caught Crail's wrist in his right hand and twisted. The knife fell from Crail's fingers and hit the floor with a sound like a bell being struck once. Boone's hand was still on Crail's wrist. He could feel the bones beneath the skin thin and fragile compared to his own, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he closed his hand completely, those bones would break. The knowledge sat in his palm like a loaded gun. The wanting was there, the old wanting, the cold darkness that said crush, break, destroy. End this. End him. Make sure he never touches her again. He looked at Crail's face 6 inches from his own and saw fear, real fear. Not the performed caution of a man negotiating with a threat, but the genuine animal terror of a man who has just realized that the creature he provoked is bigger and faster and stronger than anything he prepared for. And at the same time, behind Boone, Alara moved. She did not step back. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She reached across Pruitt's desk and picked up the revolver that the sheriff had set down when the hearing began. She brought it up in both hands the way Boone had taught her left hand under right grip firm, and she pointed it directly at Judson Crail. "Stop," she said. The word filled the room. It was not shouted. It was spoken with a clarity that needed no volume, the clarity of a woman who had spent 2 years being told to be silent and had just discovered that her voice was the most powerful weapon in the room. Crail's eyes moved from Boone's face to the gun in Alara's hands. He looked at the muzzle. He looked at the woman behind it. He looked at the hands holding it steady, unwavering, the hands of a woman who had learned to shoot in a clearing behind a cabin on a mountain and had put rounds center target before she had learned to stop flinching at the recoil. The room was frozen. No one breathed. The moment balanced on a point so fine that a whisper could have tipped it either way. "Alara," Boone said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man speaking to the one person in the room whose next decision mattered more than anyone else's. "You do not have to do this." "I know," she said. Her eyes did not move from Crail. "I am choosing not to shoot." She lowered the revolver, slowly, with the deliberate control of someone who wants every person watching to understand that what is happening is not weakness, but strength. That the gun is being lowered not because she cannot use it, but because she has decided in full possession of the ability to cause harm, not to. "I am not like you," she said to Crail. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry. "And you are not worth becoming." Boone released Crail's wrist. He opened his hand and stepped back. His fingers uncurled one by one like a man setting down something heavy that he has been carrying for a very long time. Pruitt was already moving. He came around the desk with a pair of iron cuffs that had been hanging from a hook on the wall behind him, and he put them around Crale's wrists with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this enough times that his hands did not need to consult his brain. "Judson Crale," Pruitt said, "you are under arrest for assault, coercion, unlawful imprisonment, and trafficking in human persons." Crale stood with his hands cuffed in front of him and looked at the room full of people who had feared him and obeyed him and turned away when his wagons rolled through town with canvas tops that sometimes moved in ways that canvas should not move. He looked at them, and they looked back, and what passed between them was not justice. Not yet justice would come later in a real court with a real judge who was not Morton Fletcher. What passed between them was something simpler and more immediate. It was the sound of a lock opening, the sound of a door that had been sealed for years swinging wide, the sound of a town taking its first full breath in a very long time. They let him out. His boots scraped on the plank floor. The door closed behind him. And the room erupted not in cheers, because the people of Elk Crossing were not the cheering kind, but in the particular restless murmur of a community that has just witnessed something it will be talking about for the next 50 years and has not yet found the words. Alara stood where she was. She had not moved since lowering the gun. Her hands were at her sides now empty, and she was looking at the place where Crale had been standing with an expression that Boone could not read. He walked to her. He stood in front of her and waited until her eyes found his. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, slowly. Then the shaking came. Not the shaking of fear. The shaking that comes after fear has passed and the body finally allows itself to feel the enormity of what has just happened. She shook the way a tree shakes after a storm, every branch and leaf trembling with the residual energy of forces that have moved through it and moved on. He put his arms around her. In the middle of that room, in front of every person in Elk Crossing. He held her against his chest, and she pressed her face into the wool of his shirt and shook, and he held her, and this time no one whispered. No one turned away. No one pretended not to see. The ride back to the cabin took 2 hours. The sun was high and the air was cold, and the world looked the way the world always looks after something terrible has ended, ordinary and bright and slightly unreal, as if the trees and the snow and the sky have not yet been informed that everything has changed. Neither of them spoke for most of the ride. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. They rode side by side through the pines, their horses walking in step, and the only sounds were hooves on frozen ground, and wind in branches, and the occasional call of a hawk circling high above the tree line. That night the fire burned low in the cabin. Alara stood near the window watching stars appear in the dark sky one by one, as if someone were lighting candles in a room so vast that no single flame could illuminate more than a tiny fraction of it. "I kept offering myself," she said quietly, "because it was the only value I thought I had." Boone stood behind her, close but not touching, present without pressing. "You have more," he said. "I know that now." She turned to face him, and for the first time since he had found her beneath that broken wagon, he saw her face completely free of fear. Not brave despite fear, not strong through fear, free of it. As if fear had been a garment she had worn for so long she had forgotten it was separate from her skin, and she had finally taken it off and discovered that underneath it she was whole. She stepped closer. She placed her hand flat against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm, strong and steady, the heartbeat of a man whose heart had been beating alone for 3 years and was only now remembering what it felt like to beat for someone. "I want you," she said. "Not because I owe you, not because I am broken, because I choose." His breathing slowed. "You are sure?" "Yes." He searched her face one last time, looking for doubt, for obligation, for any trace of the compulsion that had governed every interaction she had ever had with a man. He found none. What he found was a woman looking at him with clear eyes and a steady gaze, and making for perhaps the first time in her life a decision that belonged entirely to her. He kissed her. Not rushed, not hungry, slow and careful the way a man handles something he has wanted for a long time and is afraid of damaging with his eagerness. Her hands slid around his neck, his arms wrapped around her waist, and this time when she settled into the space between his arms, there was no hesitation from either of them, no pulling away, no fear standing between their bodies. He held her the way he held everything he had decided to keep, firmly, completely, as if letting go was no longer a language he intended to speak. "You are not too big," she whispered, and for the first time something that was not pain or determination crossed her face. A smile, small and real. He almost laughed. The sound surprised him. He had not laughed in 3 years. "I was scared," he said. "So was I." He brushed the hair from her face with fingers that could have broken a man's jaw but moved across her skin with the lightness of a man touching something he considers sacred. "I will never take from you," he said. "I know." That night was not about proving strength or claiming territory or any of the things that men and women sometimes use intimacy to accomplish. It was about trust, about two people who had spent their lives building walls, choosing together to leave the door open. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a gentleness it had not shown in weeks, as if even the weather had decided to give them this one night without interference. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and two people who had each believed they would be alone forever discovered that they were wrong. Spring came slow to Montana that year. The snow melted into streams that ran fast and cold between the pines. Grass pushed through frozen ground in patches of green so bright they looked painted. The air warmed by degrees so small you could not feel them from one day to the next. But over weeks the change accumulated until one morning Boone stepped outside and realized he did not need his heavy coat. He repaired fences. He cleared the area behind the cabin and began laying the foundation for a barn. Elara planted seeds in a small garden plot near the south wall where the sun hit strongest. She spent hours on her knees in the dirt, her hands working the soil with a patience and care that she had never had the opportunity to apply to anything that belonged to her because until now nothing had. She laughed more. She spoke louder. She walked with her head high and her shoulders back in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had curled herself into a ball beneath a broken wagon and waited to die. News came in pieces over the following weeks, delivered by Pruitt and Dawson and Nettie, and the occasional traveler who passed through what was no longer quite so remote a corner of the territory. Crail had been transported to the territorial prison in Helena to await trial. The evidence in the ledger had been forwarded to the territorial prosecutor. Fletcher had been removed from the bench and was under investigation for corruption. Gentry had provided additional testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming details that the ledger alone could not prove. 3 of the other women listed in Crail's records had been located and were in the process of being freed from various arrangements across the territory. Nettie Greer opened a laundry in Elk Crossing. She hung a sign above the door with her name on it, painted in letters she had chosen herself. And the first time Elara rode into town and saw it, she stopped her horse in the middle of the street and sat there for a long moment looking at those letters and smiled. Old Dawson came to visit more frequently than he ever had before. He claimed it was because the coffee was better at Boone's cabin than at his own, which was true, but the real reason was simpler. For 30 years, Dawson had lived alone on his mountain and told himself that solitude was freedom. He had recently begun to suspect that what he had called freedom was actually just loneliness wearing a better coat. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the peaks and the sky turned the color of fire over the mountains, Boone stood beside Elara near the stream that ran behind the cabin. The water was high with snow melt rushing over rocks, with a sound like constant applause. "I was ready to live alone forever," he said. "So was I." He took her hand. Her fingers interlaced with his small, against large, warm against warm. "I do not want to any more," he said. She squeezed his fingers. "Good." Weeks later, Sheriff Pruitt rode up to the cabin carrying papers. He dismounted with the slow movements of a man whose knees had been having an argument with his weight for the past decade and were currently winning. "Land claim," he said, handing the papers to Boone, "if you want it." As a household, Boone looked at Alara. She looked back at him, and the look that passed between them contained an entire conversation that took no words and lasted no more than 2 seconds and covered every topic that mattered. She nodded. Pruitt cleared his throat. For a shared claim, the law assumes marriage. A heavy, meaningful stillness settled over the clearing, a silence not of fear, but of profound understanding. The kind that falls when something important is about to be said, and everyone in the vicinity knows it and is giving the moment the respect it deserves. Boone turned to her. "You do not have to." She smiled, the full version, the one that started at her mouth and went all the way up to her eyes and stayed there. "I want to." They married beside the stream where the snow had first melted that spring. No large crowd, no grand speeches, just Pruitt, who served as the legal witness, Ashby, who performed the ceremony with the gentle brevity of a man who understands that the words are important, but not as important as what the people saying them mean by them, Dawson, who stood in the back and blew his nose loudly at the end and claimed it was the cold air, and Nettie, who held a small bunch of wildflowers she had picked that morning and cried without making a sound. Boone held Alara's hand throughout the ceremony, his grip steady, his eyes on hers. "You are not property," he said quietly when Ashby asked if he had words he wished to say. "You are my partner, and you are not my shield," she replied. "You are my home." When Ashby finished, Boone kissed her forehead first, then her lips, gentle and certain the way a man kisses a woman he has chosen and been chosen by without doubt, without hesitation, without any of the uncertainty that had marked their first weeks together. A few weeks later a letter arrived. The paper was fine. The handwriting was neat and precise. It came from a law office in Virginia City. "Judson Crale owes my client a considerable sum," the letter read. "This sum includes the value of certain assets which Mr. Crale contracted to deliver but failed to provide. We intend to pursue recovery through all available legal channels." Boone read the letter twice. He folded it and looked at Alara. "The mine owner," she said. "Yes." "He is not finished." "No. But this time I am not alone." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took the letter from his hands and walked to the fireplace and held it over the flames until the paper caught and curled and turned to ash. "Neither am I," she said. Years passed. The cabin grew. A barn rose where empty snow had once stretched unbroken from the tree line to the stream. A second room was added to the cabin, and then a third. The garden expanded. A small herd of cattle appeared on the hillside, tended by a man who had once sworn he would never build anything again, because building meant having something to lose. Children came. Their laughter echoed through the valley in summer, and their footprints tracked the snow in winter, and they grew up knowing that the big quiet man who was their father had once lived alone on a mountain because he was afraid of his own strength, and that the woman who was their mother had once been kept in a locked room by a man who thought he owned her, and that both of them had chosen a different story. Alara sometimes touched the faint scar on her shoulder. The brand had faded over the years, softened by time and weather and the slow, persistent work of a body healing itself. It was still there. It would always be there. But it no longer defined her. It was a word in a language she no longer spoke. One evening, years after the trial, years after the last letter from Virginia City, years after Crale's name had become the kind of cautionary tale that old men told around stoves in hardware stores, Alara sat on the porch of the cabin that had grown into a house. The sky was burning orange over the peaks. The air smelled of cut grass and pine and the particular sweetness of Montana evenings in late summer when the heat of the day releases the scent of everything that has been growing since spring. She leaned back against Boone's chest. He was sitting behind her on the bench he had built the previous autumn, wide enough for both of them, solid enough to hold his weight without complaint. His arms were around her. Her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder. The valley spread out below them green and gold, and the stream glittered in the low light like a ribbon of silver laid across the land. "You were right," she said softly. "About what? You were too big." He frowned slightly. For what? She turned her head and looked up at him, and the smile on her face was the smile of a woman who has traveled a very long distance from where she started and is sitting exactly where she wants to be. "For my old life," she said. He pulled her closer. His arms tightened around her, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built and watched the sun go down behind the mountains that had sheltered them and tested them, and witnessed every step of the journey that had brought them from a broken wagon in a blizzard to this bench this evening, this moment. The wind moved gently across the plains, not screaming, not judging, just passing through the way it had always passed through, carrying the scent of pine and grass and distance, touching everything lightly and holding on to nothing. And for the first time in their lives, neither of them felt like something waiting to be buried by the next storm. They felt like something built to last. And here is the truth this story leaves behind. It is not about the size of a man, or the strength in his arms, or the number of enemies he can face down on a frozen porch with a rifle in his hands. It is about choosing. Boone Calloway could have killed. He chose not to. Elara Whitmore could have run forever. She chose to stand. And sometimes, maybe not often, but sometimes the bravest choice a person can make is not to fight, but to let someone come close enough to see the damage and trust them not to make it worse. So let me ask you something. When was the last time you stood up for someone? Not because it was easy, not because anyone was watching, but because it was right, and because you were the one who was there, and because walking away would have meant becoming someone you did not want to be. If this story meant something to you, a like helps more than you might think. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy in silence, share it with them. Sometimes a story is the nudge a person needs. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one, and let me know. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Leave a comment. I read every single one, because one honest choice turned a pale hand reaching out from under a broken wagon into a life built side by side on a mountainside in Montana. And it is never too late to choose a better path forward.